Perhaps you think you are immune to propaganda and that you are too sophisticated to fall for false information. But let me ask you a very simple question. Are people more afraid of sharks or bees? It is a well-known fact that most people would express a greater fear of sharks, but the stats don't lie. In terms of fatalities, more people die from bee stings every year than shark attacks. In fact, on a global scale, in 2020, there were only 10 shark bite fatalities. By contrast, in the United States alone, the CDC estimates that 62 people die each year from an allergic reaction to an insect sting. While this may not be political propaganda, it begs a huge question. Why are we more afraid of sharks than bees? Well, when was the last time you heard a news story about someone dying from a bee sting? Or when was the last time you saw a series of Hollywood blockbusters about people dying from bees? The lack of media coverage and cultural associations with bees as dangerous likely contribute to the misperception. Shark attacks are sensationalized in the media and our minds, so examples are easier for us to retrieve. And the easier it is for us to retrieve an example, many times through exposure to media, the more likely we are to perceive it as being prominent. Think about it. If you're asked how frequently people divorce after the age of 60, what is your first cognitive impulse? It is to think of any examples in your personal life or any recent news that you may have heard. If examples are hard to bring to mind, you would be likely to rate the frequency of divorce after 60 as quite low. This all seems obvious enough, but let's consider an interesting example of how your own perceptions about yourself can be easily influenced. Namely, if you had to rate your level of assertiveness on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you rate it? And before you answer, could you come up with at least 12 examples of times you were assertive? When researchers asked this question to participants, people found it quite difficult to come up with 12 examples, and as a result lowered their self-score of assertiveness. But when people were only asked to give 6 examples, the self-scoring of assertiveness rose. Why? Not simply because coming up with 12 examples is harder, but because people assumed that the more fluently their examples came to mind, the more assertive they must be. The issue that influenced their perception was their experience of fluency of recall, not the content itself. Now, are you ready for a plot twist? When researchers used a ploy to explain away the fluency problem, people no longer used it in their self-evaluation. Let me explain. Take the example of the self-assertiveness evaluation. Researchers would ask subjects to come up with 12 examples of being assertive, but would add that they were going to have music playing in the background, which they said would make recalling examples more difficult. This was simply a ploy, but it worked to diffuse the assumption that fluency of recall should be easy. And as a result, these subjects showed higher levels of ranking self-assertiveness because their expectations about fluency of recall had been recalibrated. Now, there are a lot of things going on here, but the key concept in Chapter 12 of Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is that our automatic system 1 creates unconscious expectations that influence our evaluations. Once we become aware of the biases our mind tends to create, we can escape that dynamic, but it takes a lot of self-awareness. But how can we use this concept to our advantage? Well, one clever college professor found a way to influence the ratings his students gave his class online. Can you guess what it was? Well, he asked for a number of suggestions on how to improve his class. The more suggestions he asked for, the more highly students rated his class. Why? For the same reason we saw in the self-assertiveness evaluation. When participants are asked to give more examples, they find it harder to do. This dynamic runs counter to their expectation that constructive feedback should be easy to give, which makes them feel that their criticisms are not very significant after all. So the more they were asked to critique the class, the higher they rated it. So the next time you scoff at whether you could be manipulated by propaganda or misinformation, remember how easy the process really is. Your perceptions can be easily altered, even about yourself, based on the information you can readily recall. So be very careful about the media you consume and do your own research. And of course, try to use this knowledge for good and not for evil.